Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Nurse. I'm President of the Royal Society, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion on behalf of the British Academy and the Royal Society, because it is so cross boundaries, on the topic of what it means to be human. Now, before we start, I have a couple of things I have to say. The first is to make sure that you've all turned off your mobile phones. If you could do that, that would be very helpful. The second point is to let you know that this is being filmed. It's both being webcast and recorded for that. And there's also a crew, a TV crew from the BBC, and this will be included in a programme that will be going out in a few weeks from now. So just so that you all know that you are being filmed. Now, this is a really interesting topic. I have to say that Adam, I'm going to say something in a moment about him, and myself talked about this a few months ago as being a really interesting topic that does indeed cross the boundaries. Because are humans unique? We may never know whether animals, dolphins, spiders, finches, and the like, whether they wonder what they are made of. But we can certainly say that exploring the human body, the human brain, and human society and how all that works has long been a human preoccupation. Fellows of the Royal Society have investigated all aspects of the human body and brain, from one of our founding fathers, Robert Hooke's investigations of the function of the lungs and his models of memory, through temperature regulation, the nervous system, effects of diet on health, and so on. Now, currently, researchers continue to study how we evolved, how we communicate, how we interact with other humans, and the nature and function of our brain. Today, as I've just said, it's a joint initiative of the Academy and the Royal Society, and we're going to take stock of what new perspectives there are on what it means to be human. There was a seminar earlier this afternoon at the British Academy which reviewed new perspectives on the human as a thinking, evolving species and as a cultural, social and technological beast. And I'm pleased to welcome Sir Adam Roberts, as I've already said, President of the Academy and seminar participants to the Royal Society tonight. This evening we'll be exploring what it means to be human from the perspectives of neuroscience, evolution, communication and behaviour. We have 4 eminent panellists, each of whom will offer their insights from their own perspectives before we open up to a broader discussion. We'll first have a discussion amongst the panellists, and I'm going to open it up to the audience. Our 4 panellists are neuroscientist Professor Colin Blakemore, evolutionary psychologist Professor Dunbar, evolutionary anthropologist Professor Ruth Mace, and evolutionary biologist Professor Pagel. Now, of course, by focusing on these particular perspectives, we are undoubtedly not covering the whole story of being human, and I wouldn't want you to think that this was all that was being done to understand ourselves. Just yesterday, for example, a workshop on human enhancement and the future of work took place at the British Academy, and this is part of a project on human enhancement. However, tonight we will focus on what it means to be human, what makes us so, whether our brain, how we evolved, or how we communicate, or how we interact make us human, and whether we are really that different from other animals. Now, I'm going to introduce each panel member in turn. They're going to talk for around 5 to 7 minutes, and then I'm going to open up a discussion between them and then with the audience. Our first panellist is Professor Colin Blakemore. He's here. I'm going to say a few words, Colin. Just sit there for a moment. All right? Colin Blakemore, FRS, Professor of Neuroscience at the University of Oxford. As a neuroscientist, he's researched vision and the development of the brain, and pioneered the idea that the brain has the ability to change even in adulthood, the topic of his Royal Society Ferrier lecture in 2010. He currently researches the earliest stages of formation of the human cerebral cortex, the capacity of sensory areas of the cortex, and also Huntington's disease. Colin, welcome to the podium.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, we have an interesting question before us today, what it means to be human, what does it mean to be human? And let me state my, as it were, philosophical position before anybody has a chance to say anything else. I think that this is not a metaphysical issue. What I would be very reluctant for us to discuss this evening is whether there is something which is not only distinctive about human beings, but just fundamentally different from the rest of the organic world. And the reason I say that is because we have, from Darwin onwards, a remarkably convincing description of how the phenotypic characteristics of different creatures, that is, their distinctive features and the way in which they're adapted to the world, have emerged, and how their genes and inheritance are responsible for that process. It would be deeply disturbing to biology and to science as a whole if that were challenged in our concepts of humanity and how our special features are created. So many species are special. I mean, all species are special. Some clearly special in ways that human beings are not. Elephant trunks, echolocation in bats, navigation in migrating birds, just a few examples of characteristics that we don't have and in some respects are superior to ours. So we shouldn't be too egotistical in our view of the special nature of human beings, except for one feature which I'll come to in a moment. Just some facts, first of all. The human species first Homo sapiens and the stabilization of our genetic makeup, more or less, probably about 200,000 years ago. That coincided with, perhaps was accompanied by or preceded by, a relatively sudden expansion in brain size. Brains have been expanding through the primate line, but there does seem to have been a jump in relative brain size when you take into account body mass and things like that, which is interesting to biologists because brains are very hungry organs. Your brains are consuming about 20-25% of the oxygen and the glucose circulating in your blood. So when you see an obvious disadvantage in a morphological change, in a species progression, naturally, thinking in Darwinian terms, you have to look for the advantages. I'm sure the rest of the panel will tell us about those. But I'll pose what I think is a paradox, that the advantages of the large human brain and the potential that our brains give us have become apparent, and particularly spectacularly so, only since the speciation of human beings, and actually mainly only very recently in our cultural history, in the last 5,000 years or so. And the first evidence of trade, about 100,000 years or maybe a bit more ago. Agriculture, perhaps 30,000 years ago. Reading and writing, 5,000 years ago. Art, maybe 70,000 years ago. Mathematics and then science, 500, 600, 700 years ago or thereabouts. And those things have generated a huge change in the way that we live. Our phenotype, our cultural phenotype, is spectacularly different from that of people living even 1,000 years ago. Those changes in our makeup, in the way that we behave, the way that we interact with each other, the way that we live, cannot be explained, I think, in any simple way by genetic changes. We've done them ourselves. We've bootstrapped up our cultural and cognitive phenotype. And that is distinctive. We have to ask two questions. If those disadvantageous brains, the huge energy-consuming brains, evolved and stabilized without the full capacities that they were capable of being expressed and being deployed adaptively to sustain that sudden change in morphology, then how was it sustained? And secondly, How did we get from there to here with those huge differences, apparently, in cognitive function, cognitive ability, some would say, certainly the use of cognitive capacity in the last few hundred years? Well, I'll throw one idea out for discussion, and that is that a distinctive feature of our biological makeup, not qualitatively different from that of other species, but quantitatively, simply because of the size of our brains, is our ability to modify our brains through our experience. Every time you form a memory or learn something new, I mean, by definition, something must have changed in your brain to implement that learning and that memory. We have the ability to make those kinds of changes to an extraordinary degree, and what's more important, through language, to transmit the knowledge to others to change their brains as well. We call it education. So we share the plasticity of our brains, and through language, the capacity to move new bits of information and new skills to other people collectively in ways that are really rather different from that of any other species, but entirely biologically explicable. I'm not suggesting that this capacity for change is not determined by our genetic makeup. It is, and we're beginning to learn more and more about the genes that allow us to do that. But it's a very, very interesting and challenging piece of biology to conventional Darwinian thinking, because the genes that allow us to form new memories, to learn things, to share them, and so on, those genes don't know what the content of the new memories and learning are going to be, by definition. So those genes have created organisms which are capable of escaping from the informational constraints of their own genome to a degree, to an extent, which far, far exceeds that of any other species. So we're able to get away from the simple behavioral limits of what's programmed in genetic structure. But we can do it because we have cells with genetic expression patterns that make neurons capable of change. There's no magic in Darwinian terms, but it does involve a different sort of evolutionary process.
Thank you, Colin. If I could introduce our second panelist, Professor Robin Dunbar, FBA, Professor of Evolutionary Anthropology and Director of the Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology at the University of Oxford. He is co-director of the British Academy Centenary Research Project, Lucy to Language, the archaeology of the social brain. His principal research interest is the evolution of sociality, with specific focus on humans, non-human primates, and ungulates. He's also studying Viking communities in Iceland and the nature of storytelling. Robin.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pick up where Colin left off, I think. And my starting point really is, I think, without any question, really, the difference between us and other species of animals that we share the planet with, in the end, comes down to the extraordinary cultural capacity that we have. And this is not really with my biologist hat on. I'm conscious also that in one sense it just puts us as part of a continuum. We are not at the end that different. But what I'm going to argue, I think, is that there has been a quantitative change at some late point in human evolution that in effect has produced what physicists, I guess, would call a phase shift, a qualitative change that has come off the back of a modest quantitative change. And it seems to me that quantitative change goes back to the kinds of social cognition, social understanding of the world that you live in as an organism, that primates in general are very good at, and many other species of animals and birds may also be good at, but primates, it's a speciality, I think. And in the context of humans, we can get a sort of scale on this, I think, in terms of what's become known as mentalizing or mind reading. And the classic sort of version of that is what developmental psychologists have spent the last decade, doing a huge amount of work on, is the capacity to understand another individual's mind state. And that's commonly known as theory of mind or second-order intentionality. So I suppose that Paul here thinks that something's the case, second order. Children pass that at the age of 5. I suspect that's about the limit for great apes. I'm happy to let great apes run at about that level of social cognition. That's already quite an achievement. But it's clear that adult humans can do much better, and it turns out that the level of competence they have is something equivalent to fifth-order intentionality, which is something that looks a bit like, I'm wondering whether Paul here supposes that Colin thinks that Ruth believes that Mark knows the answer to the question, what it means to be human. So we're all waiting for the last talk. No pressure. Okay, to be honest, I think we still don't really know what this stuff is. We have no idea what it really is. However, what we have been able to show from a series of neuroimaging studies is that individual differences in these competences, so the level up to which an individual can perform, correlates with the size, the volume of bits, particular bits of the brain. And those bits of the brain are here in the frontal cortex, just above the eyes, basically, and on the temporal lobe, just beside the ears. And those are the two bits of the brain that have really expanded dramatically in the course of late human evolution compared to other primates. This appears to be a real quantitative effect. So people who are better at these mentalizing kind of tasks have bigger chunks of neural bundles, as it were, in those areas. These are real individual differences. And not only that, but that correlates with the size of your social network as well, in a three-way correlation. So we've shown that in a series of neuroimaging studies. They've been confirmed by at least 2 other groups of people who've done similar follow-up studies, as it were. And very nicely, it's been shown in macaques recently at the individual level. So this is really quite spectacular. And there's more in the pipeline, I can tell you. Okay, the key to this, or the key issue that arises out of that, is what fifth-order intentionality, or at least these higher orders, whatever they may be, actually allow you to do. And my pitch really is that it's really only once you get up to these very, very high orders, and really probably fifth order, that you can do cultural things on a scale which suddenly opens up, if you like, new windows of opportunity, whole new vistas. And those things are the capacity to really imagine other worlds. And that's important for several reasons, not least the fact that we're standing here today. It gives you culture in general, because it gives you storytelling. It allows you to imagine that fictional characters might be doing something and for you to understand it. It gives you religion, another form of storytelling. And more importantly than anything else, given where we actually are today, it gives you science, because it's that capacity to step back from the world and ask, could the world have been other than we see it to be, or experience it to be, that is at the heart of the whole scientific endeavour, as it were. And I'm using science in the very broadest possible sense here, of the academia, as it were. It allows you to ask questions about the world, to come to an understanding of how the world works and how it's come to be and why it has to be the way it is, as it were. So it seems to me that this is only possible once you get up to these very high orders. And those very high orders, given that they're tied into the size of key bits of the brain, could only have come very late on. And in fact, our calculations now suggest that fifth-order intentionality would only have emerged once you had the brain size of anatomically modern humans. Certainly not before 200,000 years ago, possibly as late as 100,000 years ago, because it looks like there was another late phase shift in brain size at that point. Interestingly, there were other big brain hominids around at the time, namely the Neanderthals, whose brain sizes were the same as ours. But it turns out that their brains must have been organized differently. They had almost certainly much more visual area in their brains, and also much more somatic management area. Once you factor those out, you get a brain size equivalent that is no bigger than the brain of archaic humans. Now, archaic humans could have had culture and they could have had language off the basis of this, but they're not getting past fourth-order intentionality. They simply weren't able to get over that extra hump, as it were, that seems to allow the system to open up into whole new vistas. So what is peculiarly characteristic of humans, I think, came in very late, relatively speaking. It sort of pitches back to what Colin Renfrew was saying earlier, I think, that sort of efflorescence of cultural stuff that happened with what used to be called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution really was a late sea change that happened during the course of human evolution and changed our world very dramatically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. Our next panelist is Professor Ruth Mace, FBA, Professor of Evolutionary Anthropology at University College London. She studies human behaviour and life history as adaptations to local environments in Africa, Asia, the UK and Europe. She specialises in research on parenting, family structure and social interaction, including cooperation and competition within families and within wider groups. Ruth.
Okay, well, I was asked here today in part to talk about parenting, and you're probably sitting there thinking, well, what's special about that? All mammals parent, so what's that got to do with any of these high-minded issues that we've been discussing? And I want to just quickly have 5 minutes to explain to you that I believe it probably has quite a lot to do with it. So if you just cast your mind to thinking about how we evolved as hunter-gatherers. Now, you know, we don't know what our ancestors exactly, how they lived, but hunter-gatherers we often use as a sort of reasonable model. And basically, we are living as hunter-gatherers as these kind of long-lived cooperative breeders. Now, I'll explain what that means. We live in families, but we don't just live in nuclear families. One family tends to live with all sorts of other families. So we're living with both related and unrelated individuals. Now, how do we parent? Well, one of the things we do that none of the other great apes do is we actually provision each other. And we don't just feed our young with breast milk, we actually wean our young quite early, and then we feed them with food. So food is being transferred, but not only the mother is helping get that food, the father is helping to get that food, other males in the group are helping to get that food, grandmothers are helping to get that food, and individuals are all feeding each other. So this is what I mean by sort of cooperative breeding. And as you also probably know, our hunting strategies are quite reliant on large prey. This is very often a cooperative venture, so men go out and hunt together. They don't necessarily just eat the food out in the bush, they bring it back to the camp and it is shared. So we have this unusual system that great apes do not do this. This is completely different. What are the sort of evolutionary consequences of this? Well, some of them are to do with our physiology, if you like. So the human life history is characterized by, I've already said, long life, but it's also got some other features. So, for example, basically we have this long phase called childhood. Then we have this females have this rather manic phase where they're reproducing, and they have lots of dependent offspring at the same time, whereas an orangutan, she'll have one offspring, she'll wait till it's weaned, and then she'll have the next one. Human females don't do that. They have multiple dependent offspring, and they cannot raise them without the help of all these other alloparents who help feed them. And then we have menopause, which, again, you might not have thought about, but it's actually not something that we see in other great apes. And in fact, one of the repercussions of being a sort of cooperative breeder is that the human generations don't really overlap. So if you think about it, if you're female and you're reaching age at first birth, your mother's reaching menopause. If you're reaching menopause, your mother's dying. So there are 3 generations almost with different sort of functions, if you like, in the family, or perhaps waiting to breed. Now, Sarah Hrdy in particular and others have made the point that if this cooperative breeding has sort of shaped our physiology, which some of us think it has, then why not also our cognition and our emotions? So we are actually living in a system where we cooperate with each other through this feeding, which, as I've said before, other primates really don't. They very, very occasionally, chimpanzees might trade food for sex, but it's very, very rare. But in hunter-gatherers, this might be very, very common. And if you just imagine that you're trading bits of food for anything, this is really a breeding ground for all sorts of features that might have led to this higher what we've basically ended up with culture. Because think, you've got childhood, you've got all different generations interacting with that child, feeding it. So what a perfect breeding ground for the evolution of social learning. Perfect breeding ground for the evolution of teaching. If you're exchanging food, then you can start to need allies. You might make reciprocal relationships with people. There might be delayed reciprocity. You might remember who helped you. You might want to go to another group to visit. Perhaps your daughter's reproducing and you want to help her there. She's dispersed and living elsewhere. So you might be making allies with all sorts of other groups. And all these cooperative relationships can start building up. And therefore, it suddenly, you can see, other primates are not operating in this way, but you can suddenly see, we don't know how language started, but you can start to see that once you're a sort of trading species almost, or you've got all these provisioning, cooperation, allies, kin all over the place, things like language start to be very important. For example, you've got shared expectations once you start making these kind of relationships. So maybe theory of mind does start to become more important. Delayed reciprocity, so you have to remember what people look like, and you have to remember who's who, and reputation starts to matter. I don't think animals care much about their reputation because they're not entering. If you're not entering into these cooperative relationships, you don't really need to worry about your reputation. You just need to scare the hell out of anyone if you want to get something out of them. But it's more complicated than that with humans. So I simply want, and obviously, of course, once you can speak, you can gossip. So that is obviously lethal to your reputation if you do something bad. It's not just the people that see you, it's anybody who's been talking to anybody who sees you. So it makes the possibility of all these sort of cooperative rules and norms starting to be possible in a way that's not really possible in any cultural animal. So I'll just leave it there. I think I've had my 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ruth. Our final panelist is Professor Mark Pagel, FRS, who builds statistical models to examine the evolutionary processes imprinted in human behavior, from genomics to the emergence of complex systems through to culture. His latest work examines the parallels between linguistic and biological evolution. At the University of Reading, he has also used statistical methods to reconstruct features of dinosaur genomes and to infer ancestral features of genes and proteins. Mark.
Gosh, that sounded very, very scary. I promise you I won't make you learn any advanced statistical models tonight. Before I get going, I want to thank everybody for coming. It's really thrilling to have you all come along and to try to understand this very interesting question. And I should say that as an evolutionary biologist, I have this wonderful job that I'm supposed to try to figure out why animals do the things that they do. And one of the most interesting animals, because we stand out for doing a lot of very strange things, is humans. And I've been asked tonight to talk about one of the unusual things we do, which is that we have language. So one of the things that it must mean to be human is to have language. And I think that we all realize that there's something unusual about human language, but we're not quite sure what it is. And so let's just back up a little bit and realize that all animals communicate, and so do most plants, and even yeast and bacteria, and probably viruses communicate. But I think only humans have language. So there must be something unusual about language. And what is that? What is it that distinguishes language from all these other forms of communication? And why do we have language and no other species does? Well, I'll get a little bit technical, but I think you'll enjoy it. Human language is distinguished by being what's called compositional. We speak when we're on our good behavior in complete sentences that have subjects and objects and verbs. And that means that we have a form of language that we can call a digital form of communication, because those subjects and objects and verbs we fill in our sentences with discrete objects that we call words. And so I might say, I kicked the ball, or Robin stole the chalk. And in each of those cases, I'm putting in a discrete object, a word, into a place in a sentence that has some meaning. Well, the interesting thing about compositional communication is that we know that digital forms of communication, like our language, or like Morse code, or like our own DNA, another form of digital communication. So Morse code has dots and dashes. Our DNA has 4 chemicals called bases. And what we know about digital systems of communication that distinguish them from all other kinds of communication is that they evolve when there's a need for great fidelity of transmission and great variety in that transmission. So we see digital forms of communication arising when we have to pass some information along from one individual or organism or agent to another over and over and over without losing the fidelity of that message. And we also see digital forms of communication arising or information transfer arising when we have to have great variety. So our genomes are capable of enormous variety. All of the animals and plants and so on Earth come from a very small number of different bases, these 4 chemicals I told you about. We know that Morse code is capable of mimicking our language. It's just a very cumbersome way of doing it. And of course, our own language is capable of almost infinite variety, isn't it? I mean, it is capable of infinite variety. So if I have just 20 words for subjects and 20 words for verbs and 20 words for objects in subject and verb and object sentence, I've already got 8,000 distinct sentences I can make. Okay, so against that backdrop, we want to understand why it is we have that funny form of communication and no other animal does. And natural selection tells us that we can't just go out looking for bits of our brain or genes that we might have and say, oh, that's why we have language. Because natural selection is a very stern master and doesn't just give us things and say, go out and play with it, but it asks us to earn those things. So the things we have, like language and other traits we have to pay their way by giving us some advantage that we wouldn't otherwise had we not had that trait. So most attempts to understand human language take 2 approaches. I mean, one is we go back into our past and we look for bits of anatomy that organisms in the past might have had that share a history with us, or we look for bits of DNA, or we look for behavioral things. And so we look to the brains of chimpanzees and our ancestors like Homo erectus and the Neanderthals, and we find that they had regions of their brains similar to ours. Or we might even find that close relatives of ours had bits of DNA like ours. There's a very famous gene at the moment known as FOXP2 that the Neanderthals had that seems to be implicated in language, and so many people think the Neanderthals spoke. I think this is faulty reasoning, but this is how language is often investigated. Or we might look to behavioral things we have in common, like gestures with the other primates, and say perhaps they had language if they had these gestures and these bits of the brain and so on. But the trouble with those approaches is that they just don't even begin to answer the question of why would you have this trait in the first place? And that's what we've got to do. So we need another way of understanding why we have language and why we alone have language. And here you might say it's really easy to answer that question. You're thinking these guys get to call themselves professors and FRS and FBA, and they ask silly questions like why might we have language? Because the answer is obvious. It's for communication. But I put it to you that all animals want to communicate, so that's no answer at all. And it's even more fun than that, because when it comes to human language, there's 2 evolutionary problems that we've got to solve before we can get language to evolve. The first one is that when I'm using my great language to speak to you, anything I might say to you could benefit you at my expense. Well, that's an act of altruism on my part. And natural selection never rewards naive altruism, because you'll happily take that information from me, knowing where the good mushroom patch is down the road, and you'll get those mushrooms before me. So surely that aspect of language favors people who keep their mouths shut. All right, well, let's assume then that I got over that problem with language, so I'm going to use my language instead of giving you information. I'm going to use my language to deceive or manipulate you for my benefit. But if you now know that I'm using my language to deceive you for my benefit, well, surely that will favor people who don't listen. So how do we overcome this problem with language? It seems so obvious that it's for communication. But wait, let's think a little bit further. What if we used our language to reach some sort of cooperative agreement about something? What if we used our language to negotiate something? What if we used our language to reach an agreement that was mutually beneficial in a way that if we didn't have language, we couldn't benefit? Now we're both better off than we were without language. And to see how utterly dependent so much of our culture that we take for granted is upon having language. Imagine this scenario early in our evolution before we had language. So we don't have any of this fifth-order intelligence stuff that Robin was going on about. We just don't have language yet. I'm really good at making arrows, and you're really good at making bows. I want some of your bows. So I get my arrows one day. We don't have language now, remember. I take my arrows and I come to you and I put them at your feet, hoping you'll get the idea that I want to exchange them for bows, and then we'll both be happy. But you think it's a gift. You pick up my arrows with a smile, beatific sort of smile. You walk off. I chase you gesticulating because I don't have language. I'm gesturing like all other primates. You turn around, stab me with one of my arrows, and run off. All right. Now, imagine this simple act of exchange if we have language. I come up to you with my arrows, and I say, you seem to be really good at making bows. What if we trade some of my arrows for your bows? You're bad at making arrows, so you think, here's a reason to talk to me. Now there's a reason for me to speak to you and for you to listen. Now, as obvious as this sounds when you hear it, as just patently obvious as it sounds when you hear it, we are the only species probably in the world that can benefit from that kind of communication. Because believe it or not, we are the only species in the world that practices very elaborate forms of specialization and task sharing. So some of you in the audience tonight are probably lawyers, some of you might be butchers, some of you might be bakers, others candlestick makers, some of you are doctors, some of you are airplane pilots, and that's all you do. And you get everything else you need from something somebody else does. Well, that's been a feature of human societies probably for 150 to 200,000 years, that we could specialize and then exchange our goods and services and knowledge and wisdom and skills with others. And you can see that that requires language. And so I think this starts to provide us now with an answer that makes sense to us about what it means to be human. One of the things it means to be human is to live in these cooperative societies in which we exchange. And for that, we need this trait, this very unusual trait, that's very distinct from all other forms of communication that we call human language. Thanks.
So we're going to open up to some questions, but I'm going to ask two questions first before opening up to the audience. And the first may be a non-question, because I want to ask whether any of the panelists disagree with anything that one of the other panelists said. So I'm going to ask that first.
Give us a minute.
We wouldn't dare.
I'd be very disappointed if there is no disagreement.
This is probably trivial, as it's simply a matter of degree, but Colin said something about genes stabilizing some time ago, and yet we know that it's very recent that we've learnt to digest milk. We have got the genetic capacity to digest milk, digest alcohol, and these are all adaptations to becoming farmers, which have caused genetic change. And you can imagine that culture would change the selection pressure on something like reading or writing or all sorts of cognitive things, I would think. So how confident would you be in that statement that our genetic makeup is not evolving, or not much?
Well, I'm not a geneticist, but would appeal to what the geneticists in the study of genomic structure say, which is that the major changes and reorganizations of the genome that seem to lead to the speciation of human beings happened about 250, 200,000 years ago, with maybe some, as Robin said, some further minor changes perhaps 150,000 years ago. Of course, beyond that, there are pressures that cause the relative selection of particular individuals or groups on the basis of polymorphisms in existing genes, variations within existing genes. And we can see how that's been exploited by human beings, particularly during migrations. The migration out of Africa required special, or led to the selective survival of individuals who are better equipped to deal with the climate out of Africa. But these are not changes in the basic number or function of the major genes. And to the extent that human beings are different, and they're probably even the differences from apes are very minor, but they're fundamentally genetically different from apes, that all happened 200,000 years ago or thereabouts. That's my understanding. Others might challenge that.
Well, no, I don't want to challenge that, but I wonder, it might be of interest to the audience to realize that even though the basic ground plan for being a modern human might have been in place 150 to 200,000 years ago, that we are very much still evolving as a species. And the question is often asked, have we stopped evolving? And the implicit reason that question is asked is because we think our health service keeps us alive no matter how fit or unfit we are, and so on. But in fact, humans really are still evolving and might be evolving quite rapidly as culture changes and the things that it means to be human change. And so no one should go out of here thinking that it's all over. We're still evolving as a species.
Any other disagreements?
Could I just make a point? If you look at the variability of brain structure and size between individuals, you can do that between different pairs of individuals, identical twins, genetically identical, non-identical siblings, or randomly selected individuals of the same gender, similar age, and so on. What you find is, not surprising, there's more variability between the non-related individuals. But even in identical twins, there are quite big parts of the cerebral cortex which are as different between those two twins as between randomly selected pairs of matched, non-related individuals. So there is a lot of freedom and flexibility, at least in certain parts of the cerebral cortex, and it's those areas that I think one would look to for these the functional changes and even structural changes that can happen in individuals that could explain the continuing evolution of culture.
So I have a real question, a second question for me, which I guess is mainly aimed at perhaps a different perspective from you too. Because if brains were, let's say, more or less where they are now 100,000 years ago, why is it, as Colin was saying, we only acquired what we think is really to be human in the last 5,000, 10,000 years? Is there something to be talked about here?
I'd put it back a lot earlier than that. I mean, I guess the issue is culture is cumulative, so knowledge increases generation on generation. So there seems to me a big difference between saying that the start of what you might think of as modern human culture, as opposed to culture that you might see in other animals, goes back to maybe, I don't know, say the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or perhaps the sort of period 70 or 80,000, 100,000 years ago in Africa, and saying that since the agricultural revolution in the Neolithic 10,000 years ago up to now, things have exploded. You know, in some sense, the capacity is to make these cultural changes is what's critical, and that was early. I mean, you know, my analogy always comes back to the computer. You know, Babbage invented a computer effectively as a counting machine, but once the stuff is there, the same software can be used for innumerable purposes, you know, word processing, stock keeping, all painting cars or whatever they use in industry. So it's a sort of exploitation of what amounts to a window of opportunity, permitted by this, in crude terms, the size of the computer.
Colin?
I don't think it's difficult to understand how cognitive capacity and not capacity, but activity, if you like, could have changed over a much longer period of time, exceeding the period when there was fairly good genetic stability. Because two of the genetically determined features of human brains permit that. One is language, and the other is plasticity, being able to reorganize. We put those two things together, and almost anything's possible. What is surprising, though, is that those capacities come at a cost, and they come at the cost of the size of the brain, and brains are very expensive organisms. And I've never been convinced by any of the accounts, of conventional selective accounts, of how we got suddenly a very big and very expensive brain that was capable of doing all the things that we do now, but wasn't doing them at the time. So what was it doing at the time that was adaptive enough and valuable enough to conserve this enormously disadvantageous brain?
Please.
Well, I think there are some quite convincing population genetic type models of cultural transmission which show that you need a certain population density before certain kinds of complex cultural traits can actually take off in a population, because the argument goes that even though we had probably the mental capacity, it's only in parts of the world where population density started to get quite high that there were enough individuals to teach each other these complex tasks. And some of the best sort of anecdotal evidence for that is, I think it's the Tasmanians, who lost a lot of cultural complexity by virtue of their population being isolated and being small. And that you cannot have complex institutions in very small and very scattered populations. So the argument has been that, even though there probably weren't genetic or physiological or, morphological differences between populations, populations adopted different levels of complexity in their culture at different times, almost entirely dependent on the population density at the time. And I personally find those models very convincing, because there is this problem of why was it, if we were genetically the same, why in some cases did culture take off and in other cases not? So I would say that would be one of the major explanations for that gap.
Good. Well, now I'm going to open up questions to the audience, and I'm going to explain certain rules first. The first rule is that you have to wait till you have a microphone, and there's 2 microphone runners. Could you just put up your hands with the microphone? There. And you shouldn't speak unless you have a microphone. The second rule is that we would ask that your question is not long. This is so we can actually get a number of questions. So please, we're not interested in a monologue. And if it turns into a monologue, I shall try and stop you. So that's the second rule. And the third rule, or just a way of proceeding, not a rule, is that we'll collect 2 or 3 questions at a time, because it makes it a more fluid discussion if we do that, before I ask the panel to respond. And if I could ask the panel to note down the questions so that they can then respond to 2 or 3 in one go. So hands up, please. And we'll start here with 1 microphone here, and then the second one over here. Good.
One quick question and one quick proposal. The quick question is to ask the panel to compare this cooperative evolution that took place in apes, in us, with the evolution of cooperative specialization in the cell, from the single cell to multi-celled organisms. Is there an analogy here? And the second point was the proposal, was that to suggest that perhaps the evolutionary advantage of the inefficient organ of the brain was, it's a rather pessimistic proposal, was warfare.
Thank you. Here, please.
Yeah, the question which is unique to the human being, and that is justice. Now, I'm talking about justice from a primitive society in which it is basically fairness between individuals and achieving whatever has to be done within that society, to the more complex one in which we reach a standard of social and criminal justice. And I would like the panel to talk on that matter, because it is very important to all human beings, and particularly modern ones.
Thank you. One more question at the back, just there. Thank you.
I'm a little confused with, well, I disagree that we're unique. I think we're just lucky we have humans, then the Neanderthals, and another species called the Denisovians. Or why can't you explain the human mind in a convergent way? Because as I understand, the Denisovian genome is found in modern humans in places like Papua New Guinea, I think, and like Indonesian islands as well. Is this idea of uniqueness just sort of a throwback to the religious idea that because we're human and we're like I do agree that we're the only species that have developed in a way that we've actually left the planet. But have you forgotten also that we have opposable thumbs? Because Professor Dunbar says, well, they, they didn't make a leap. Well, as I understand it, and as I've read it, they buried their dead, they looked after their young into old age. They behaved cooperatively, and they even made their own tools and even made jewelry. So how have they not made that leap? Could you not explain Neanderthals in a convergent manner instead of just saying, well, they weren't like us, their brains were arranged differently, therefore they weren't equal to us? That sounds a little bit strange to me.
Good, thank you. A range of questions, so over to the panel now.
I'll take up the first question that the gentleman asked about cooperation in cells versus cooperation in great apes. And it's a very technical question at one level, but at another level it really illuminates something quite extraordinary about what it means to be human. Now, remember I talked about specialization in my little speech, and I said that we were the only animal that had this elaborate task specialization. But if you look inside your own body, it's a citadel of specialization. So you've got about 300 different kinds of cells in your body that are highly specialized. Heart cells, nerve cells, kidney cells, liver cells, hair cells. They all share the same genome, but they're different kinds of cells, and they're cooperating to make your body work and survive and allow you to reproduce. And I said that our kind of cooperation also had this task specialization. And what's so really remarkable about that is that the only other place where you see this kind of task specialization, such as in our bodies, is in the social insects, the ants and the bees and the wasps. And there again, they live in these colonies or mounds or hives, and they're all highly related to each other, just as the cells in our body are. And so natural selection has worked out how to get them to cooperate because they are, in some way, ensuring that other copies of their genes get transmitted to the future. So this really shows starkly how different we are, that we don't cooperate with each other just to advance copies of genes in other people because we're unrelated to those people. We're not like ants in an ant colony, or we're not like the cells in our body sharing so many genes. And that's a really remarkable thing about us. We have worked out the rules of cooperation among unrelated people, and that's a dangerous thing to do because, as I said, at any given time when I cooperate with you, you might take my largesse and walk off with it. And so it's a very technical question, but one that illuminates this cognitive and psychological and social leap that our species made to be able to cooperate in ways that bring benefits, higher benefits than we could have by acting alone. Who's next?
Did I do the last one?
Yes, please
All
do.
right. I'll be very brief. I think the answer here is I'm not really interested in making humans unique or special. My background really is as a biologist, so all species are interesting, and I've worked on a wide range of mammalian species as well as on birds. What I am interested in is explaining the individual uniquenesses of individual species, if you like. So, I happen to work on feral goats when I can't think of anything better to do, which is enormous fun because they're incredibly intelligent and fun to work with. But, and the questions are the same. Why do goats do what they do? Why do any species? And we do have something to explain with humans, I think, because at the end of the day, okay, we are primates and we share lots of our history of primates, and then therefore we share lots of our cognition and biology, anatomy and physiology with other primates, in particular. But there are unique features that I think are undeniable in terms of culture that humans exhibit. If only the capacity to build these buildings and sit in them and have discussions. And that requires an explanation. And that's all I'm interested in providing, if you like.
There's a question about why Neanderthal died out and we survived, which is very interesting, and I don't know, I haven't seen a convincing explanation of that, but it's obviously a very challenging issue. It is worth remembering that I think it's the case that the numbers of Homo sapiens were down to a very low level at one point, about 150,000 years ago, approximately.
Yeah,
It's
200,000. Yeah.
Very small numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, some people estimate 1,500 individuals. And certainly it's a very interesting time to be studying human genomes, because it's clear that there were a number of subspecies occupying overlapping territories. It's getting very much more complex with interbreeding and so on, becoming much more complex. So then why only us? Why do we have only one species of Homo sapiens now? That's an interesting, really interesting issue. We don't know for sure whether Neanderthal had language, at least fully developed, syntactically complex language like modern humans, and it could be that was a difference that was significant enough, particularly when interacting with human beings. I mean, the presence of human beings, Homo sapiens, in the same territories as Neanderthal probably played a large part in this process. We were just perhaps nastier than them and wiped them out, perhaps.
One possibility, isn't it? But I mean, it is interesting. I mean, it always seems Neanderthals are a strange case, if you like, because they're unbelievably successful for 200,000 years at these latitudes. And our ancestors turned up out of Africa and overlapped with them from about 40,000 years ago until about 28,000 years ago or so, and the last ones died out. And why did they die out? But one of the key things about them, I think, goes back to what their cognitive capacities might have been like, is I don't think their material culture, the kind of tools they make, come close to what you see in modern humans in that time. I mean, there's been a lot of attempts to defend the Neanderthals and argue that they were becoming modern in a sense. But you just have to look at their toolkit. It's really relative to what anatomically modern humans were beginning to produce at that point already quite primitive. And I just don't think they had the cognitive abilities to support a much more complex culture that would produce more complex toolkits. The other possibility is they're living at much lower densities, which goes back to the point Ruth made. And maybe that has a lot to do with it. And one of actually raised the question as to why, I think it was humans live in large communities or need large brains to live in large communities. One of the key issues, certainly at high latitudes, is probably trading to allow you to go and reciprocate access to other people's resources, because these kind of latitudes in particular are so unpredictable and unstable. And if you're living at low densities, which Neanderthals in later stages may well have been doing, it's just sort of downhill all the way, because you just don't have enough sort of geographical spread in your population to be able to engage in those kind of trading capacities.
Any panelists want to have a go at justice? Yeah, please.
Oh, well, I mean, okay. There are different beliefs about this, but I mean, I think I mentioned to you that in hunter-gatherers there are often very strong norms around things like, for example, sharing food. So it's socially unacceptable to bring food. In many, many groups, it's completely socially unacceptable to bring food back to the group and just give it to your own family. I mean, if it's seen by the others, it will be shared. And that's probably just one of many norms. There's all sorts of rules about what you are and what you aren't allowed to eat, and food taboos. And, there's going to be a range of social systems, some of which will help. You might consider this to be fairness, but hunter-gatherers don't normally sort of punish each other in a very formal way. It tends to be quite peaceful. And I think one of the tactics they use quite often is that if you find yourself with an uncooperative band or people you don't want to live with, you just walk away. I mean, you just go and associate with other people. And there are actually mathematical models that show that that system alone can be quite effective to evolve cooperative norms or fairness norms and this kind of thing. But it only really works when, you have that option. And you can imagine that once population densities get higher, and things like farming and occur so that you can't just walk away because you've got your bit of land and that's where you live, you can imagine that trying to get people to cooperate could start involving more sort of actual punishment or aggression, and that could get quite costly. So there was mention of criminal justice systems. Well, that seems to be, those seem to emerge when population densities get to a certain level, again, then maybe one of the specializations in society could be that you're actually willing to have certain members of the society do the punishing for you, so that you agree. And there's also actually been some quite interesting sort of economic games experiments where people are playing what's known as a public goods game, where you put money in and it gets doubled and the pot gets shared. So if you cooperate and all put lots of money in, everybody does very well, but people soon work out they can cheat and not put money in and still get some of the pot. But if you introduce punishment into those games, people are willing to spend money to punish individuals that don't cooperate, and that suddenly makes the group cooperate much more. And then if you add to that game the choice of which group to go to, in the end, everybody moves over to the game with the punishment. So we don't like punishers, and we don't actually... but on the other hand, we actually don't want to live in systems which don't have punishment. If when punishment is there, the system actually works better to everybody's good. And I think that must be why we're willing to pay for a criminal justice system to, even if we might find it irritating at times when we want to do something that is against the law, we'd nonetheless rather be living in that kind of a system, and therefore that kind of specialisation, as it were, arises at a certain level.
Mark, I think I might have cut you off. Did you want to?
No, I don't want to belabor it. It was just another topic or another question about the Neanderthals, but maybe we should move on.
No, go on. Let's have it. Quick.
Well, I think everybody in here should realize that when modern humans walked into Europe about 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals had been there for about 300,000 years. And when we walked in, I mean, you can imagine a scenario in which a sort of band of hippies walked in. We had musical instruments, we had art that was beautiful art that you would lay out hundreds of thousands to buy now if you could. We had music, we had specialization. We were making fish hooks, we were making special kinds of blades. We could sew clothes, we had bows and arrows. Neanderthals didn't have any of that. I mean, they had a very, I think, literal, plodding, unimaginative existence. And so we really were a different kettle of fish when we walked in. And I think what really kind of makes this point clear is that when the Neanderthals went extinct 28,000 years ago or so, one possible scenario is that they were sitting in a cave in Gibraltar and they were freezing to death because the world was getting colder. And they were looking across the Straits of Gibraltar to North Africa, but they couldn't make the boats to take them there, just 8 to 10 miles. So that tells you how limited they were compared to us. And so I think agreeing with Robin really, that their culture was very simple compared to ours. They probably didn't have language, I would argue, and that we really were something very different.
Good. I'm going to now open up for questions again. So 3 more questions. Quick. Right. Let's get a microphone to somebody. Over here and another one over here. There we go.
May I ask a panel to comment on possible influence of our integration with digital technology, especially the possibility of enhancing our body with implants?
Good. Thank you. Over there, I think there's one.
Yeah, it seems to me that natural selection...
Maybe it'd be good if you could stand up, actually. A question, I should have asked that, because it's easier to see for the panel. Yeah.
It seems that natural selection is playing a different role in the third world and the Western world. In the Western world, survival is the least of our worries. We get modern medicine, we can go to the fridge when we're hungry. But in the third world, survival of the fittest really does matter, especially in like famine-ridden Africa, for example. I was wondering if the panelists thought that perhaps there might be a 2-tier civilization forming in the future, and their views on that.
Thank you. And yes, there's a question just here. Yeah. And then we'll get some questions further back after that.
Yes, I was intrigued by the certainty with which the Neanderthal brain was described, and I'd just like to ask, how do you know that it had a greater visual area? And then the second point, could I ask the panelists what sort of areas of research they think are going to answer some of our questions or redefine the questions in the future?
Very good. Okay, over to the panel. You've got 3 questions.
Implants, technology, fusion with technology, will it affect our evolution? Well, of course, and that's not a new thing. The invention of tools certainly influenced the course of human cultural evolution. Instruments for farming, reading and writing, enormously influential. Calculators, computers. I mean, I think this is something we should applaud in a way. We have the capacity to make things which can extend our own abilities, and not just that, to remove responsibilities and needs from our brains in a way that might free up our brains to do other things. I really think there's no reason to believe that people in 500 years' time won't look back at us in the same way that we look back people 500 years ago and thought that their cultural development was very thin, sparse, and primitive compared with ours. And one thing that will contribute to that continuation of cultural evolution is the ability to use bits of technology to do things that we have to do with our brains at the moment.
Can I just sort of actually pick that up and run with it a bit further? Because one of the kind of critical things probably, and Mark alluded to this in terms of the division of labour and specialisation, because I think what agriculture, for example, did allowed some people to sit back and ponder and think great thoughts. And that surely was absolutely critical in allowing the development of modern technology and science and so on. So one can only imagine that improvements in technology which remove from you the labour of everyday grubbing, as it were, is simply going to open up even more opportunities for that. That said, I'm not 100% convinced that the technology is there yet, because the obvious one is Facebook. And one of the questions I constantly get asked is, does Facebook allow you, internet technology basically, allow you to have more friends than you can do in the real world? And the answer seems to be no, and that's Facebook's own data. And indeed, all of the work we've done on this suggests that actually Facebook and the like, other social networking sites, are very useful and perform a very useful function, but there's a cognitive constraint and there's a time constraint still on the number of relationships you can hold in place. But while I've got the floor, I'll just answer the question on Neanderthal brains very quickly, and the answer is it turns out that there's a very strong relationship between latitude and essentially the size of the eyeball you need to maintain visual acuity under declining light levels. And in modern humans, let's say historically modern humans from the last 200 years, there's a correlation between latitude, eyeball size, visual area in the brain, and brain size. So as you go further and further north, or as well, we don't know whether that's a genetic effect, although there are genes that are very recent that have also correlate with this, that affect brain size. But as you go further north and south from the equator, so you get bigger eyeballs, you get bigger visual systems, and therefore, because we were desperately trying to hang on to the rest of the smart bit of the brain, because this is just jobbing processing, human brains get bigger as you go towards each of the two poles. Now, if you translate that into the Neanderthals, they did indeed have much, much bigger eyeballs than we had. They're about 20% bigger than ours, and they're about what you'd expect them to have at that kind of latitude. So if you just follow through the arguments, you lose vast chunks of the brain that is just being devoted to kind of jobbing processing rather than kind of smart thinking.
It is worth pointing out that the visual areas in Homo sapiens also vary hugely between individuals by a factor of 3. The primary visual cortex, the main visual area that receives from the eyes, varies in size between individuals by a factor of 3, and that correlates with the size of the eyeball, the number of fibers in the optic nerve, the number of cells in the relay nucleus on the way to the cortex. You might ask, well, goodness, what genetically could tie all of those things together? They're all in different places, all being built differently from different stem cells. And the answer is that it isn't genetically co-determined. The things are all controlling each other during embryonic development. And I think that's a really important clue to how complexity can evolve. The fact that the plasticity of the brain applies to the developing brain as well as the mature brain. So if you happen to have, presumably genetically determined, a somewhat bigger eye, you will automatically get a somewhat bigger visual cortex, because they control each other.
Anybody want to have a go with natural selection in different populations, third world versus Western world? Anything to say there?
Well, I just want to say, I work with demographic data quite a lot, and I have to say, infant mortality really is plummeting just about everywhere, with a few obvious exceptions. But I mean, even in countries where you think it might not, in fact, the probability of children dying in childhood is massively improving everywhere. So just to put in a slightly optimistic note. But then the wider point, okay, is there natural selection on different? Well, I think it almost goes back to what I said at the beginning. I think there is natural selection. We know does operate differently if you're living a different kind of a life. So. But there's also some very strong effects which we don't think are genetic. So, for example, in the West, we're picking up all kinds of diseases to do with being overweight and all this kind of thing. And in much of the third world, a lot of people are also suffering from those diseases because they've moved from environments where maybe they were brought up in an environment with not very much food, a lot of gut parasites, running around everywhere, running to school, taking a lot of exercise, and then maybe they moved into a city and started eating high-fat food and not doing very much, and then they turn out to be even more susceptible to some of these diseases than we are when we've maybe lived like that all our lives. So I think the kind of overall picture I get actually is of problems across the world becoming more similar rather than more different, I think. But that doesn't rule out the notion that natural selection is acting slightly differently in different places. So that's just sort of answering it from the biological point of view rather than the political point of view, because obviously wealth and all sorts of other things are going to, there's all sorts of political answers you could give to that as well. Although I would just like to say that there's a sort of group of, even though the infant mortality is going down, there's, sort of teenagers and young men and this kind of thing. I mean, there are kinds of mortality popping up that I think are being a bit ignored because both in sort of deaths in wars, but also deaths from suicide, deaths from crashing cars, deaths from getting into drug fights and shooting each other and all this kind of thing. And I think that child mortality, there's been huge efforts from governments, from Gates Foundation, all sorts of things, which are really having an impact. But, maybe it's time to start thinking a little bit higher up the age group, actually, which I think people talk a bit less about, and that these problems are actually possibly not getting better in the way that, possibly getting worse, unlike the infant mortality.
I think the panellists have been a bit discreet in not trying to identify which areas of research they think will be most important in the future. Good.
I think that this lady's question is a very good question. Before I answer that, I'd just like to say this gentleman asked about digital enhancement. I'd love to have a bit of digital enhancement, but I think it's illegal now. Now, what kind of questions should we be asking? I mean, this is a really good question, and it's the sort of questions that we should be posing. And there's probably a couple of weeks of answers to these questions, but one of the things that is different about humans that leads to a whole lot of questions we might ask is getting back to this idea that in our societies we can specialize. Now, think about natural selection. In most animal populations, natural selection removes differences among people. So if you're a cheetah, the best way to be a cheetah is to be able to run fast. Okay? Slow cheetahs, go hungry, right? And they die. If you're an antelope, the best thing to do if there are cheetahs around is to be able to run fast. There isn't room for cheetahs to sit around and do art and poetry and so on. They've got to run away from cheetahs. But in our societies, we allow this specialization, and we allow people to do things, as I said, and that's all you do, and you can trade and exchange with others. And this raises a very, very serious point about humans, which is that natural selection might have, throughout our history, 150, 200,000 years, have actually cultivated differences among us. if you're really, really good at design or mathematics or music or art or something, it could be that you've been allowed to specialize at that and pass your genes on as a specialist. So to the extent that differences in human talents and skills and so on are heritable, and there's a lot of evidence that many of them are, that doesn't mean they're 100% determined by genes, but there's a strong genetic influence, then there might be real differences among us in our talents and skills. And that's a very, very awkward thing for society to have to confront. But increasingly, as our societies make it more sort of equitable in the sense that we have this idea of equality of opportunity, we deliver everybody with equal probability to the doorstep of opportunities, but it's going to be the case that not everybody is equally good at all those opportunities. And so we have possibly confronting us a very awkward social challenge that we might be differentiated by our talents already, and a policy of equality of opportunity, which I think we all support, could lead to a society further differentiated by its genetic differences. Now, please don't take this as an advocacy of eugenics or of stratification. What I'm saying is that this might be lurking amongst us in ways that we don't fully realize yet. And the same technologies that we use to identify medically related differences among us, risk of heart disease, risk of diabetes, and so on, one day when we understand our behaviors, we'll be able to identify genetic differences among us in our abilities to do various things, to the extent that that's actually true. And we don't know the answer to that at all yet, but I think that's a very serious problem we need to be thinking about.
The question about what areas of science will be most important in the future in this area, because the temptation is to say mine. But you can see from the composition of this panel and from the program of the symposium this afternoon that this is an area where the real contributions will come across the boundaries of conventional disciplines. And the fact that this is a shared meeting between the British Academy and the Royal Society shows that perhaps the most interesting boundaries are actually between what are conventionally in the humanities and in the sciences, between psychology and cognitive science and anthropology and genomics and neuroscience. All of them are playing into this discussion. So it's a real argument for interdisciplinarity, breaking down traditional boundaries.
Well, anybody want to be more contentious than that and say my area is more important? We're all too polite. Right, now, can we come into the middle? Can the two microphones go into the middle towards the back, and we'll try and pick out some that have been ignored. Right. Find some. There's somebody at the back there. Doesn't matter. Go on, choose somebody. You're there. And another one on that side. Okay, stand up and speak, please. Right. Not at the same time, if you don't mind.
There are two examples I can think of where people are human, but in a somewhat different way from others. One of them is where people are born profoundly deaf or blind, if you like, missing in one of the fundamental senses. And the other, which Professor Blakemore mentioned briefly, is that of identical twins. I'd like to ask all the panel members if these sort of rather special cases of being human matter and give them insights in their work.
Thank you. Over there. Yep, thank you.
As a lot of other species have evolved to combat problems, say in Australia with the snakes after the introduction of the cane toad, why have humans got taller over the past, say, 100 and 150 years?
Thank you. Move forward and find somebody. Thank you.
I wonder if I could say, perhaps you are answering the question, what it means to be clever. And so perhaps I'd ask you all, if you cut out the cleverness from human beings, would they be human? And then also, if you took a clever human being who you regarded as inhuman, what would their inhumanity be about?
Okay, right. Over to you. Yes. Any one of them.
I'll take up the last question, if I understood it. What was the question? Are we clever? Or what was the question? Sorry.
Are we defining humans as what it means to be clever?
Yeah, no.
It's not a very clever answer.
It's memory. Well, it's memory that makes us human. Were the panel inadvertently answering the question, what does it mean to be clever?
No, we're
so
not.
I'm saying, well, if we weren't, then identify which bits have been
Yeah,
human,
no,
but are not covered by clever, and then the other one about inhumanity.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question because you see, as soon as you say it's all just down to cleverness, you have to realize that as you get good at doing the things that we like about being human because we're clever, there's somebody who's going to be equally good at undermining that. And so cleverness alone can't explain what we do. So if I'm really good at cooperating with you, you might be really shrewd at taking advantage of me because you're so clever. The other thing is that humans really aren't all that clever. We do a lot of really stupid things. So we take a lot of risks. We crawl out on the ice to save a dog that's drowning. We're not good at judging probability. So there's a lot of things we're not good at. We're not actually all that inventive. We're very good at copying other people. How many of you know what the optimal way is to pay into your pension plan? So what do? You copy the people near you, or you go to somebody for advice. So no, I don't think we are defining humans as just being clever. There's something about us that's a little less dim-witted than the other animals, but that certainly isn't sufficient to describe what we do. And the last bit, I'm not clever enough to remember. It was something about if you take that away, do you get somebody who's nasty? I can't remember.
What's inhumanity in a clever person?
What? Well, inhumanity in a clever person is just all the things I think we all agree on. I mean, it's the sort of Lex Luthor sociopathic personality, because and a lot of the shrewdness of human nature is about being that way, is about manipulating others. And so that's why we aren't just defined by our cleverness. Those sides of us, the sociopathic side, the manipulative side, the cooperative side, they lurk in all of us. So, yeah, there's the answer.
I might go a little further down that road and say the key thing that's critical for humans is the ability to cooperate. The ability to cooperate depends on the capacity to inhibit prepotent action. That's to say, inhibit your instantaneous desire to do something. In other words, to take the big piece of cake now, rather than wait and let other people have it. I mean, social cooperation on the scale we do it critically depends on that, and that seems to be something that kind of across the primates gets bigger and bigger and bigger as a, in terms of the capacity to do it, until you see it sort of in very big scale in humans. And if you took that away, you would precisely end up with a bunch of thugs, basically, or chimpanzees, who are incapable of supporting a very large community size, and it's the large community size that solves the ecological problems for you, and has allowed us, or for us, and has allowed us to, or any species, I suppose, allowed us to be as successful, I think, as we are. So we actually would never have got here. We hadn't been able to engage in that sort of separation of long-term and short-term rewards in life.
I think you can go deeper on this question and challenge what you mean by cleverness, because the question was predicated on the assumption there's only one kind of cleverness. Cooperation, except in the crudest sense of just sheer weight of numbers, only works because different individuals have different abilities. And we heard the example of the bow making and the arrow making. So what's good about human capacity to cooperate is the fact that it can use the different talents of individuals and the different sorts of clevernesses, if you like, of individuals together in order to produce more than the sum of the parts. And a species that's capable of codifying, talking about its behavior in the way that we are at the moment, to think in terms of justice, of altruism, of rights and so on, can certainly live with the notion that identical twins and someone born deaf or blind is not excluded from the community that's sharing its talents together.
Anything more on the first question or on the second, getting tall?
It just actually reminded me, there was a lovely, well, I don't know if it was lovely, there was a photo in the newspaper, it was probably in the Metro or something, about 2 or 3 days ago, of the Queen, Camilla, and Kate. And it was, I actually just cut it out because I thought I would use it in my lecture on this topic, because there was literally,
It's in Private Eye.
Was it in Private Eye? Well, I saw it all over the, I mean, it was just a genuine, they all went to tea in somewhere or other, and it was just a brilliant illustration of everyone getting taller over the last 150 years. So, I mean, I guess the boring answer is that, we have, obviously got more food. But a more interesting answer is that actually when you watch populations growing, and I remember a paper about a sort of a cemetery that had been studied in the US, and the leg bones were getting longer and longer. But it's not true that, for example, your arm bones get longer and longer, or your head gets bigger and bigger. I mean, it's not that everything gets bigger. This is actually, there is it's not just sort of more food in, bigger human out. There's obviously some sort of phenotypic plasticity, to use a technical word, which just means that when you put more food in, like having long legs seems to be a bit of a luxury. So if you've got plenty of, once everything else has been sorted out, if you've got plenty of food, you can grow those legs. And I think it's really about sexual selection, because there's lots of evidence that tall people are considered quite attractive.
I object to that being 5 foot 5.5 inches tall.
It was too late to stop the story by the time I kind of realised that.
Now, I should be winding this up, but it's such a great discussion. If you don't mind, we'll let it run over a little bit and have 3 more questions. So, because we've got plenty, just find 3 people near there. Yeah, thank you.
Somebody on the panel mentioned earlier that the human population might have dropped to as low as 1,500 individuals. That wasn't so long ago in evolutionary terms. Therefore, is the genetic diversity between the global human population now such that it would explain cooperativity in terms of kin selection in a way that we don't normally think of?
Mm-hmm. Over here, I think. Thank you.
It seems to me that one aspect of being human is belonging to a species which has developed its scientific and technological abilities far beyond the development of its wisdom, to an extent that its very survival seems to be threatened. And this seems to me to be a basic question that urgently needs answered, because if it's true, then we need to be thinking not only about what it means to be human, but what it means to be humans who survive. Thank you.
Thank you. And one more question. Yes. Could you stand up, please?
In regards to altruism and the evolution of language, is it possible that language could have evolved down some altruistic routes, given such things as Hamilton's rule and selfish gene proves there's no such thing as a truly altruistic act?
Good. Right. 3 questions there. Who wants to? Off you go.
Yes, I have a go. I wanted to take up the gentleman's question about technology, because again, it illuminates something very important about humans. This is something about us that doesn't differ from the other animals, and that's that we are, like all other animals on the planet, highly, highly evolved Darwinian creatures who have been selected intensively, and even more so since we've had this thing we call culture, this ability to learn from others and pass on ideas and knowledge and wisdom. We have been selected to be intensely greedy and reproductively successful. So we are a single species that occupied the entire world. So other animals don't do that. Chimpanzees are found in a tiny area of Africa that their genes adapt them to, but we've been able to adapt all over the world. So this is another proof that we're not actually clever at all, because we are adapted, like every other organism, to have very short-term reproductive interests. And our technologies have more than obliged us in that. All of the technologies we make. And the gentleman is exactly correct. Those technologies are now running away with us, or from us, because the world's got too many people in it, and we're poisoning it with carbon dioxide and so on. So it's another indication that, indeed, we're going to have to make huge psychological adjustments outside the boundaries of the psychology that we evolved to have, which was to be greedy and reproduce and to tromp on the people next door if we could, if it meant that we could reproduce even more and occupy their lands. I could take up the point about language, but perhaps I should let someone else.
No, please do, whilst you've got the mic.
These are extraordinarily technical questions. I'm very impressed with the audience. A gentleman raised a question about language and kin selection and Hamilton's rule, and a lot of you might have been lost, but I think the question is really one of, could language have arisen as a cooperative activity within families where we're less likely to take advantage of each other, right? Remember I said that if I give you something by talking to you, I might benefit you at my expense. So maybe language arose within our families, and I spoke to my brothers and sisters or my parents or something, and in that way they're less likely to take advantage of me because they're family members and they share genes in common with me. I think it's rather unlikely that that was, a lot of people think that, and that's been mooted in print a number of times, but I think it's rather unlikely that that was the origin of language for the simple reason, remember I told you, that what we do is we have this kind of collective intelligence. We can combine our wisdoms and talents and skills amongst lots and lots of people, and that requires this negotiation and bargaining. And generally, I'm sorry now this will make you feel bad about your family, generally there isn't enough variety of knowledge and wisdom and skills within a single family for that to be a useful strategy. So I doubt that language arose as this, what the gentleman called kin-selected and following Hamilton's rule, basically that you were just benefiting your relatives.
Colin, Robin?
Well, I was just going to comment very, very quickly on the first one. I think the answer, my gut instinct would be to say no, because although that kind of demographic crunch that happened around approximately 200,000 years ago that produced modern humans is the explanation for why the genetic variation in modern humans is very, very low indeed compared with most species. Genetic relatedness in the Hamiltonian sense dissipates very, very quickly with each reproductive breeding step you go away from yourself. And so the reach of kin selection in those terms isn't going to go out an enormous distance. I think it's probably much more important that community sizes were always very small and remained very small even when population, the total population of the species, was very large, relatively speaking, very large. That the actual community of interacting individuals was small, and there they probably were quite closely related to each other. Indeed, in traditional societies today, everybody is related to everybody else. If they're not biological relatives, close genetic relatives, they're in-laws. And it turns out that we regard in-laws, treat them as though they were genetic relatives for probably very good biological reasons, that they share a genetic interest with us in the next generation.
I think I'm making the same point. I mean, it's a very recent development in human culture that regularly interacting groups have not been closely related. I went to China quite recently and went to a small town where everyone had the same surname. They were all called Zhu. Not surprisingly, the town was called, the Chinese equivalent to Zhu town. And that's the way, of course, it was in Britain until very, very recently. People didn't move around very much. And indeed, the big translations of not closely related individuals that happened not extremely recently were mainly of slaves and kept separate, of course, with very little interbreeding. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the value of kin relatedness, and that altruistic and cooperative gestures until really quite recently have been of rather direct benefit to closely genetically related individuals. Could you just turn to the point, though, about whether science is, we're all doomed because of science. I mean, it's absolutely true that our ability to manipulate the world through science and technology have contributed to, on the one hand, our success as a species, as Robin said, the ability to populate and spread much more widely than our simple genetic constraints would lead you to expect, but also contributed to knowledge and its application in ways that are potentially dangerous. But, you know, we are where we are. And if you ask how are we going to get out of the mess that we're in, there's only one answer, and that is through our knowledge of how things work and how to tackle them. I mean, if you look at the really big challenges, things like climate change, pandemic disease, the effect of overpopulations, food supply, and so on, we only know about the problems because of science. I mean, the fact that flu is caused by a virus wasn't known until 1918. So, you know, we need science even to understand the problems that have been created by science. It may have generated some of our problems, but it is our only hope for the future.
Ruth, do you want to add anything to any of these questions?
Oh, golly.
It's not compulsory.
No, I think... I
Good.
don't think I do.
I should rise to the challenge. Your family isn't, you know, terribly smart that was thrown down by your husband.
That was the previous set of questions. No, that was all I'm talking about. Clever.
Good.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, having sort of, I remember, you know, when we were taught about the evolution of altruism many years ago, people would say, well, there's kin selection and there's reciprocal altruism, which doesn't work very well, and that was sort of it. And now there's kind of a plethora of models for how altruism can evolve, and it's almost like, you know, we used to think it was difficult to evolve. I'm now thinking it's like, how can you stop it evolving? And it's sort of popping up in all sorts of situations, and any kind of situation where people don't mix randomly. I mean, for example, there's some sort of viscosity in the population in that people who are nearby are more likely to be related to you, and you're more likely to bump into them more frequently than other people, seems to be enough in these commuter simulations to get some kind of, some sorts of altruistic behaviour to evolve. And I would have thought language as well is also a sort of mutually beneficial adaptation. It's not particularly exploitative. So I think, you know, I think once the kind of problem of how to get it started in the first place was overcome, I could imagine it spreading, you know, extremely rapidly and not be much of an evolutionary puzzle at all if we knew just how it got started.
Well, I want to bring this discussion to an end with some thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank the British Academy for coming in with the Royal Society and being here for what I think was a great event, and I think we should do more of these in the future. I'm sure we will. Secondly, I'd like to thank the audience. I think you've been a great audience with wonderful questions, really interesting questions. But most of all, I want to thank our 4 panellists, Colin Blakemore, Robin Dunbar, Ruth Mace and Mark Pagel. Thank you very much for your contribution.